Morning, everyone. It is good to see you. Good to be back here taking a look now at how Zionism comes together. The reason that we want to look at this, you might notice how each class kind of comes together, where with our first one, we really saw the destruction of the Jewish system in 70 CE. The next one, we took a look at in 135, how Rabbi Akiva sets up this idea of Kiddush Hashem and giving up yourself for the name of God. And then in our last class, we skipped forward a number of years and saw kind of the division that was taking place within the Jewish community of should we give ourselves over fully and assimilate and continue to increase wealth, take citizenship in these other nations, or is this anti-Semitism that's developing, is that something we should really be worried about and think about? So that was what was happening in Western Europe. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at a little bit of Eastern Europe and see what was happening over there, and then we're going to bring it together, because up until Eastern and Western Europe are brought together, then there wasn't a whole lot that could happen in terms of the Jewish community mobilizing as a whole. East and West had to connect. And that happens with Theodor Herzl. So we'll talk a little bit about Herzl, and then we'll discuss what's known as the Uganda Plan. So we're going to follow through the development of Zionism with the Eastern persecution, see how Herzl really gives Zionism life by bringing together the East and the West, and then we'll note how Herzl essentially disappears when he introduces the Uganda Plan. He gets all kinds of frustration from the Zionist community over this whole idea, which, by the way, Uganda Plan, anybody know where it actually was? It wasn't Uganda. Well, yes, that's true. It was in Africa. That's good. It was actually in Kenya. But maybe the Kenya Plan doesn't sound as good or something. Somebody started calling it the Uganda Plan. And back then, it was not in Uganda either. All right, so if you're thinking, historic, somebody just made a mistake, and that's one of those funny historical things where it was called the Uganda Plan, and it never actually was in Uganda. So we'll take a look at that, and we'll see what goes along there. The main thing that I want you to take from this is that Zionism almost failed, and that's what I think is so amazing about this story, is that as you are tracing this Jewish history through to see the state of Israel, you are constantly brought to this point where you're on the edge of your seat saying, oh no, don't do that, right? That's not going to turn out good. So you see the Jewish communities in Western Europe assimilating, and you say, no, you can't do that. And then God does something that makes it stop. You see this with the Uganda Plan, where they're saying, Palestine, we got to get back to Zion. And then all of a sudden, actually, let's move to Uganda. And you're like, no, don't do it, right? Constantly we are seeing these things almost fail. And it's consistently, here's this human element where we say, which decision? Let's do that one. And God comes along and says, nope, actually this way. And I think it's so powerful because history allows us to see the way that God is working and the way that God is directing, and just reminds us that he is ultimately in control, no matter what kinds of things people did to try and ruin it. So that's the core message here, that Zionism almost failed. Here's the why question. Why did Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, want to live in Uganda? Technically Kenya. What's that about? So, let's start here with the Eastern persecution. Now take a look at this map. What you will see here, this yellow section on the map, that is what is known as the Pale of Settlement. So we are turning our attention now to the east. We were looking at Prussia, Germany area. There's Austria down there. The Ottoman Empire came here in the Balkans. This area is largely Poland. You have Lithuania, Latvia's up here. And then a lot of Ukraine as well. So that's the Pale of Settlement. Now, does anybody feel like they can give a confident definition of what the Pale of Settlement was? Anyone feel good about that? Yeah, Tim.
It was basically a quite large area where they herded all the Jews into, and that was the only spot they were allowed to live.
Yeah, that's right. So it's 1791 is when this starts. So 1791, the Russian Empire says, if you are Jewish, you must move to the Pale of Settlement. So if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, right, the play, or watched maybe the movie, something like that, there's a lot of connections here to the Pale of Settlement, right, as they have to continuously move and as they experience the pogroms. We're going to talk about that as well. So the Pale of Settlement is where you had to live if you were Jewish. Now, this is interesting because yesterday we talked about the ghettos in Western Europe. The Pale of Settlement is different. So the ghettos in Western Europe were where you had to live if you were Jewish, so that part's the same, but you were confined to there. And there were no other people who were not Jews. But here, everybody in the Pale of Settlement, you didn't have to be Jewish. You could be Jewish. There were also Gentiles living there. But there were specific rules for where you could live within the Pale of Settlement. So it's like ghettos within a ghetto. So as far as the Pale of Settlement goes, you had Gentiles living mostly in the cities, and Jews were forbidden from living in the cities. So they had to live out in the country somewhere. Now, you can just think about how this would work, because if you are prevented from going to the cities, that also means you are prevented from any kind of economic wealth. You are now destined to attempt to be a farmer out here in, I don't know a whole lot about farming, so I shouldn't say very much. But this does not strike me as the best place to be a farmer. Now, I recognize Ukraine does produce a lot of food, right? But still, maybe it's just because I'm from California, but that strikes me as awfully cold to farm there. Okay, so that's what I had to do. Now, here's another interesting little piece. You were technically allowed to live outside of the Pale of Settlement if you were a Jew, but it was very technical. So let me give you, here's the stipulation. You could live outside the Pale of Settlement and actually live in the cities if you were Jewish, but you had to be a doctor. So Jewish doctors were allowed to live outside of the Pale of Settlement. Now, the reason that this is a technicality is because Jews were forbidden from getting an education. So you can work that out, right? There were definitely not a whole lot of Jewish doctors working in these cities. But, somebody who came along could say, oh, don't worry, we treat the Jews well. We let them be doctors, right? So that was the situation. So you had the Pale of Settlement. This is what it looked like. I don't know how well you can see the picture. It's very difficult to find any pictures of life in the Pale of Settlement, but you can see that it's very, what's the word? Peasantish? There's a lot of peasants around. So there you go. There's the people mingling with their animals. Here's another one. And here's a final one. So essentially, being Jewish in the Russian Empire meant that you were confined to poverty, and yet it was also held over your head that, well, you can technically escape from this poverty, but you can't actually. So it's a very strange kind of situation, almost mocking the Jews. Now, the Pale of Settlement starts in 1791, during the reign of Catherine II, and Paul I just keeps things more or less standard. Same way, he doesn't change a lot. After him is Alexander I, and Alexander I decides that he's going to be nicer to the Jews. So before him, you were not allowed to own any property as someone who's Jewish. So you had to live out in the country, and you had to rent that property from somebody as a tenement farmer. So Alexander I says, you know what? Let's be nice to the Jewish population. Let's actually tell them they don't have to live necessarily in that poverty. We'll actually let them own a small piece of their own land. So he changes the laws, and the Jewish community very much respects him for that. So Alexander I becomes known as this person who opens up the circumstances for Jews in Russia. However, so this is where we were, right? Catherine II starts the Pale of Settlement. Paul I continues it. Alexander I changes things. However, Nicholas I comes along in 1825. Nicholas I and the Jewish community remembers him as the second Haman. So you can see how, unfortunately, things changed really on the caprice of whoever the emperor was. So Nicholas I comes along, and then Alexander II. Now, here's where the problems really begin. Alexander II, he is assassinated in 1881. The reason that this is a big problem for the Jewish community is not because Alexander II was particularly nice to them, but because nobody knew who assassinated him. Now you can see where this is going. Nobody knew who assassinated him, and the typical government technique when you don't know who assassinated the ruler is to therefore blame the assassination on a minority group that no one likes. So, the Russian government comes out and says, Alexander II has been assassinated, and we know who did it. It was the Jews. Right? There was no specific Jew mentioned. It was just the Jews, all encompassing. The Jews assassinated our Tsar, and we can't believe they would do such a thing after how well we've treated them. Right? Look at, we allowed them to own property. We opened up these rules. All that we can see from this is that you can't give them anything. Right? So that's the answer that they see. And this is, the Fiddler on the Roof doesn't actually have a time period that it's based in, but it's approximately sometime in the aftermath of Alexander II. So, what's going on here is they then declare, the government makes a set of laws referred to very creatively as the May Laws, because they made them in May. May 1882, a year after Alexander II is assassinated, they create the May Laws, taking away any semblance of rights that Jews had in Russia. So here's what you get. As a temporary measure, which happened to not actually be temporary, and until a general revision is made of their legal status, it is decreed that the Jews be forbidden to settle anew outside of towns and boroughs, exceptions being admitted only in the case of existing Jewish agricultural colonies. In other words, where were Jews forbidden from settling before? Cities. Right? No cities. Well, first of all, nowhere except the Pale of Settlement. And then cities. So you had to live out in the country. Well, Jews started to get together, like those pictures that we saw. They started to say, well, if we're going to live out in the country, we might as well live in communities. So they started to make little towns. Well, this now says the only place you're allowed to live is in those little towns. You can't just go and decide, oh, you know, I want to start my own new little town. Nope, too bad. You have to live in those little towns. They were called shtetls. So you have to live in that shtetl, and that's it. The only place you can be. Number two, temporarily forbidden, which again wasn't temporary, are the issuing of mortgages and other deeds to Jews. So remember how they got some new rights? Those are now taken away. Right? We see that we can't trust them with these new rights. Temporarily forbidden are the issuing of mortgages and other deeds to Jews, as well as the registration of Jews as lessees of real property situated outside of towns and boroughs. So even if they tried to move, they couldn't actually even lease property outside of the towns and boroughs. And also the issuing to Jews of powers of attorney to manage and dispose of such real property. Number three, Jews are forbidden to transact business on Sundays and on the principal Christian holy days. The existing regulations concerning the closing of places of business belonging to Christians on such days to apply to Jews also. So any Christian holiday, including Sundays, they could not work. And number four, the measures laid down in paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 shall apply only to the governments within the pale of Jewish settlement, which is where all the Jews lived. So that's what's called the May Laws. So that's the official government response. Now the May Laws were very restrictive, but that's not actually what gets the Jewish community talking. Because what ends up happening is after the government comes out and says the Jews have assassinated the emperor, in 1881, right, the May Laws were 1882. In 1881, pogroms start to erupt around the Pale of Settlement. So pogrom is a targeted attack against the Jewish community. And here's an important thing to understand about it, though. A pogrom is designed as much as one can be designed when they're somewhat spontaneous. It's designed to increase shame. That's the whole idea. So pogrom is not to kill people. It's an important thing to understand about them. So, for instance, Kristallnacht, I referenced that earlier. Kristallnacht was a pogrom in Germany, November 9th and 10th, 1938. Jewish businesses had their windows smashed, they had all their things stolen, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested. That was the Kristallnacht pogrom. 100 Jews were killed. So think about those numbers. 30,000 arrested, 100 killed. And that's because those people killed were killed on accident. You know, it's hard to know whether or not it was an accident, but that wasn't the idea behind a pogrom. It was to shame people so that they have to figure out, how do I pick up my life when you've burned down my house, when you've destroyed my business, and you've arrested the man of the house? How do we do this? What are we supposed to do? You can also imagine the things that would happen as well to the women. I'm not going into that. So these are pogroms. So the Elizabethgrad pogrom, only one person dies. It's 1881 in April. But half of the homes are completely destroyed. Half of the Jewish homes. So that's the idea behind the pogrom. Do whatever you can to increase the shame, to make Jews hate the fact that they're Jews, and to figure out how you can ruin their lives. So you create this living death, right? That's the idea behind a pogrom. So the Elizabethgrad pogrom happens in April 1881. Now, get this, and this is what I was talking about the anti-Judaism, right? Anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism end up coexisting, and unfortunately, when we get to the Nazi era, blending together. But here, this is an instance of anti-Judaism, because this pogrom was created by Christians, and it was going to take place during the Easter week. And it was supposed to be a rub in your face, you assassinated our Tsar just like you assassinated Christ. Right? That kind of idea. So, Elizabethgrad pogrom, it was going to take place, and to their credit, the local government of Elizabethgrad said, we're not going to let this happen. So they increased the police force during Easter week. They increased the police force, nothing happened. So, unfortunately, the local government says, whew, we heard rumors that this was going to happen. We figured out a way to prevent it. Good job, us. And they sent the policemen home. Well, you can figure out what happens that night. This is from the Jewish Chronicle, which is still a newspaper today in the UK. The Jewish Chronicle records what happened at that point. Now, this is a contemporary account, right? This is from 1881 in the Jewish Chronicle. It says, the disturbance commenced at 4 p.m. last Wednesday, and the contents of several Jews' shops were stolen, damaged, or destroyed, because that's the point. The police called in the aid of the troops, who made every effort to stop the pillaging. This was, however, only effected on the following evening, and with great difficulty on account of the number of peasants who had flocked into the town from the surrounding villages to participate in the general plunder. 1 Jew was killed, but the number of wounded is not great, because that's not the point. It appears that 400 persons were arrested. The Christians attacked the houses and shops of the Jews indiscriminately by smashing doors, breaking windows, etc., up until a late hour on Wednesday night. The violence was continued throughout Thursday, but in a different form. I just want to point out, did you notice what the attackers were called? The Christians. The Jews, finding themselves vanquished, offered no further resistance, and all fighting ceased. But the rioters, aided by an influx of peasants from the surrounding villages to join in the general melee, sacked the houses of the Jews, destroyed their furniture, and stole or spoiled their wares. The military and police are represented, by the way, I can't handle grammatical errors, but you know how it goes sometimes in newspapers. So I just want you to know, I didn't put sick on there, but that was one of those moments. The military and police are represented as having done what they could to establish order, but failed to do so at once, because while they were attempting that in one place, disorder was breaking out in another. The Jewish population of Elizabethgrad is reckoned at about 10,000 persons, and more than half of their houses are completely ruined. That's April 1881, Elizabethgrad. Now, here's the major tragedy. There were 5 pogroms that are sparked by Elizabethgrad. Now, that's just sparked by this one pogrom, right? So more come out of it. And that's very much a thing. You know, when violence against a group starts, when one happens, then it encourages people in other places, right? But that's just the 5 that the Elizabethgrad pogrom ignites. Take a look at this sentence down here. The remaining 3 occurred at a much smaller scale. One attempted pogrom at the city and railroad station of Alexandria was aborted. Here's the sentence that we want. All in all, 48 anti-Jewish disturbances occurred in Kherson Gubernia between April 15th and April 28th of 1881. Now, that Kherson Gubernia is one of the sections of the Pale of Settlement. So in this little section of the section that Jews are confined to live in, there were 48 pogroms in that one portion. In the space of, did you see how long? In the space of 2 weeks. 48 pogroms in the space of 2 weeks. Now, here's one of them. The Kiev pogrom. Here's another one. The Odessa pogrom. And in fact, there's not just one. It continues through 1881 to 1882. Odessa pogroms. So the Jewish community in the Pale of Settlement hadn't given up the hope that even though they hadn't been given citizenship, that one day they would be able to assimilate like the German Jews. They heard about what was going on in Germany, and they saw the wealth that was accumulating in Germany, and they said, maybe someday we'll become like that. Maybe someday we'll be like the Jews of France. And so they were holding on to this hope. And so this person here, Moshe Lilienblum, he was one of the leaders of the Jewish community within the Pale of Settlement. And so he kept telling his followers, here's the key. Do whatever you can to get an education. Even if it means you have to do things that are illegal, get an education, because an education is your ticket out of the Pale of Settlement. You can become a doctor. You can then have a real life that's not confined by all these laws. So that was his approach. He said, you know what, you can do all of that, you can assimilate, and nobody will even know that you're Jewish. After this, after 1881, everything changes. Here's what Lilienblum writes in response to 1881. He says, I became convinced that it was not a lack of high culture that was the curse of our tragedy. For aliens we are, and aliens we shall remain, even if we become full to the brim with culture. He realizes, no matter what, we will always be the foreigners. He wrote this again in a speech that he gave to the Jewish community. The speech is called, Let Us Not Confuse the Issues. And he became a very big proponent of Zionism after this, because he says it's never going to work anymore. I used to tell you assimilate, 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 and now we can't. Now I understand. So he says, let all special questions, whether religious or economic in nature, take second place to the general question, to the sole and simple aim that Israel be, quote, saved by the Lord with an everlasting salvation. And so this is the point that he comes to when he recognizes we can't do it ourselves. Unite and join forces, let us gather our dispersed from Eastern Europe and go up to our land with rejoicing. Whoever is on the side of God and his people, let him say, I am for Zion. Peretz Smolinskin, he starts a journal, a magazine called Hasha'ar. And it becomes a big Zionist publication. In fact, if you've heard of Eliezer ben Yehuda, which I think a number of you have, he's the one who revives the Hebrew language and gives Jews a national language, right, to bring them together. Because before that, they spoke French, German, English, Russian. They spoke all these different languages, and he gives them one to unite them, right? That's a really big deal. He publishes his first essay in Hasha'ar. So this is the beginnings of Zionism, right? We heard it a little bit yesterday in Western Europe, Now we're seeing it in the East, too. What's interesting is Western Europe starts to feel Zionism even before any of the persecution. But Eastern Europe, there was this tenacity here where they were going to hold on, and it was only these pogroms, one after the other, after the other, after the other, that says, you know what, we got to change. All three of these guys were advocates of assimilation, and they switch to giving speeches, publishing journals, to say, we have to get back to Zion. All as a result of 1881. Leo Pinsker, he writes a book about it called Auto-Emancipation. Here's what Pinsker says. Since the Jews are nowhere at home, nowhere regarded as a native, they remain aliens everywhere. So you can see that same sentiment in all of them. We're foreigners. To sum up then, listen to this. I find this so powerful. He takes a group of people and he says, the Jew is the opposite of that. So he says, to the living, what's the Jew? A corpse. We're dead. That's how they see us. He's really trying to establish we will never be accepted. To the native, we're a foreigner. To the homesteader, we're a vagrant. To the proprietary, we're a beggar. Now look at this. This is what is so intuitive about what he says. He then switches it. Notice that? To the poor, an exploiter and a millionaire. And this is where he notes what makes anti-Semitism unique about all forms of hatred. All other forms of racial hatred always say this group of people should be despised because they're weak, or they should be despised because they're not smart, or something like that. Anti-Semitism is unique in racial hatred because it says they should be despised because they're smart and dumb all at the same time, right? Or because they're poor and they're rich all at the same time. Or because they suck the blood of our countries and destroy our countries, but they rule the world all at the same time. Right? Like, it doesn't even make any sense. And this is what he begins to notice. He realizes it doesn't actually matter what we do because they're going to hate us for the opposite of it. No matter what. If we integrate, they'll hate us for being integrated. If we become rich, they'll hate us for being rich. If we're poor, they'll hate us for being poor. He says, to the patriot, we're a man without a country. For all, we are a hated rival. And this was the point that the Jewish community needed to come to in order to start looking to Zion. Consequently, we are duty-bound to devote all our remaining moral force to reestablishing ourselves as a living nation, so that we may ultimately assume a more fitting and dignified role among the family of the nations. Now, I'm not going to read this quote to you. This is just from a book on Zionism. You can read it if you want, but I'll tell you what the idea is. Here's the big thing that happens. These guys in the 1880s are in the East. They are rallying the Eastern community. The problem is that nothing can really happen until East and West get together. And you have a united front amongst the German communities, or amongst the Jewish communities of Western and Eastern Europe. The problem is that those in the West are those from Germany and France. They are those who are highly assimilated, who are highly educated. Can you imagine how they think about European Jews? Right? They look at them as, there's those backwards people who never get educated. They're just farmers. And look at us with all of our advanced degrees, all of our high culture. And so these guys are saying, we got to change, we got to do all these things. And the people in the West are like, well, yeah, maybe you do, because you haven't been able to assimilate like us. You don't have that ability, right? You're just not as cultured as we are. And so there's this feeling, very much, the West looked down on the East. And so you have this problem where the East is recognizing, we got to turn to Zion, and the West won't let go. Until this guy. Theodor Herzl was what was needed. Now, he's fascinating because on one hand, he was a man with overflowing amounts of charisma. Right? He had the magnetic personality where people would want to listen to what he had to say, and he could give them a dream, and they would run with that dream. On the other hand, he was hated by people because he was very blunt, and he had very few social skills. So it's interesting to see, here he is with this exuding charisma and yet this bluntness that would turn people away. So it's a very interesting combination to see how he gets used. Now, the other thing that really strikes me about him is that he's very much like a shooting star. He appears in the 1890s, he disappears in the early 1900s, and that's it. It's as though he gets raised up for a purpose. So Theodor Herzl, nobody was able to galvanize the Jews of Western Europe until he comes along. Now, what's funny about this, again, is that he actually didn't see his life as a success. Here's the reason why. Does anybody know what his career was? Herzl was a reporter, but he didn't want to be a reporter. So he didn't want to be a writer. He was a reporter, he wrote books, but he didn't actually want to be a writer. He really wanted to be a playwright. So that was his big desire. He wanted to write plays, and he wanted to go and watch people watch his plays, see them cry over his plays. But whenever he'd publish a play, nobody would cry, right? Nobody would listen to his play. Nobody cared about it, and unfortunately, that's because his plays are pretty bad. So he wasn't good at that. But strangely enough, he finds himself really good at politics, but he doesn't care, right? He doesn't want to be good at politics. He wants to be a good playwright. So when he dies, he actually dies very depressed and dejected because he wasn't a famous playwright. So this is what he writes in his diary, right? He didn't intend for this to be published, so I'm sorry for publishing it. But this is what he writes in his diary in 1902, shortly before he dies. He says, "And yet I know that I am by instinct a great writer, who failed to yield his true harvest only because he became nauseated and discouraged." And he says, I know I could be a playwright, and yet that's not what he's going to be used for. And he gets raised up, and this is his task. He goes to school. He is one of those highly educated. He gets a doctorate in Vienna, and then he becomes hired by the Neue Freie Presse in Vienna, which was one of the biggest newspapers in Europe. So it'd be like getting hired at the New York Times, right? This is a big deal paper, and he gets hired in 1891 as their Paris correspondent. Now, it would be very difficult at the time to think of a better position for a journalist. The Paris correspondent meant you were going to be in the most cultured city in Europe, and you were going to be experiencing all of what Enlightenment life meant. This is a really big deal for a Jew to be given that position. Right, so there he is. He's sent to be the Paris correspondent for the Neue Freie Presse, which means New Free Press. And he goes in 1891, and just at that time, the Panama Canal scandal is taking place. Now, I don't know how much you know about the Panama Canal, so I'll give you a little brief update here. Here's how it goes. Panama Canal was initially a French project, right? So that's why he's hearing about it in Paris. Initially a French project, it's finished by the Americans. But it's initially French. Now, here's how it works out. This French company decides that they're going to build a canal in Panama because they've seen the Suez Canal. They've noted, wow, that's working really good. Let's do that. That'll be a good business venture. They decide that they're going to raise money through what's called a lottery loan. A lottery loan was not a good idea, but they did it anyway. And the way that it was going to work was they would get backers who would lend the money, and then they would pull a name out of a hat, and they would pay that person back with interest over time. Not over time, but over time they would draw more names, right? And they pay those people as they drew the names. So people were interested in lottery loans because it could mean that if you loan out $100,000, you suddenly get back your $100,000 with interest a month later if your name is pulled out, right? So people thought, wow, this could work out really good, this lottery loan. Well, it could also work out really bad, right? But, you know, when you gamble, people don't normally think about that part. So a lot of people pay into this lottery loan for the Panama Canal. Problem is that the three financiers who are taking care of the Panama Canal don't actually have an intention of building a canal. They just have this idea that this sounds great, and they're actually all con men. So they take the money from the lottery loan, and then they say, oh, by the way, We actually just spent it all and now we're bankrupt, sorry. We can't pay any of you back. Now, this guy here, in La Libre Parole, Justin, is that how I pronounce that? That's right? Yes, I got French, thank you. Okay, so La Libre Parole, Edward Drummond, is that right? Yeah? Wow. I always just assume that with French, everything is not pronounced how it's written. So, anyway, I try and add some ooh and stuff in there. I don't know. Anyway, I don't know, right? I don't know French whatsoever. Okay, so La Libre Parole, Edward Drummond finds out that 3 of these financiers happen to be Jewish. Now, La Libre Parole is a Catholic magazine, right? And we have seen the anti-Judaism, so far, throughout the centuries. So he locks onto this fact that the 3 financiers, 2 of them, are Jewish, and he writes all about this over and over and over in his magazine. And what he does is he stirs up anti-Semitism in a city that didn't have any, right? Because France was enlightened. This was the first place to give Jews citizenship, but this guy brings it all back. He brings it all back and he says, you guys lost all your money. You want to know why? Because of the Jews. And Jews love money. Right? And he starts saying all of these tropes. He brings it all out. Well, then, this happens. Right? You're perhaps familiar with the Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus Affair, again, was the Jewish community not actually doing anything. Right? Those financiers, yeah, they were Jewish, but that doesn't paint on Jews at all. That's that racism that we talked about. Right, where he says Jews love money. There's this characteristic, supposedly, because they're Jewish. So here, that same idea gets put onto Dreyfus. Not only do they love money, but they're also sneaky and you can't trust them. Because Alfred Dreyfus was an army captain in the French army. He gets framed for passing on military secrets to the Germans. It turns out that this was actually not correct. But by the time that was figured out, he'd already been stripped of all of his medals. His sword had been broken in half. He had been shown to be guilty, and he was imprisoned on Devil's Island. Right? He is eventually let free. But the damage has already been done. Now, keep in mind that Herzl is the Paris correspondent for the biggest paper in Europe. And so he's writing all about how anti-Semitism is growing. See how this is working in his mind? Right? He's seeing this anti-Semitism growing. He hears this about Dreyfus, and he's covering a parade in which Dreyfus is marched down the street in Paris, and he hears, now this is a little bit interesting, he hears, according to him, in the 1890s, he writes that he hears the words, "Death to Judas." Now, for some reason, maybe he didn't remember it the same, in the 1890s, when he's covering the event, he writes, they were yelling out, "Death to Judas," the traitor, right? 10 years later, when he's reflecting back on the event, he says this, "What made me a Zionist was the Dreyfus trial," and then he adds on, "because they chanted, 'Death to the Jews.'" So that's an interesting historical anomaly. We don't know what happened there, because he recorded it as "Death to Judas." In fact, the New York Times did that too. You can check their article back in the 1890s. They said it was "Death to Judas." And yet he recalls it 10 years later when he's in the midst of all of the Zionism, of it being "Death to Jews." So for some reason, his memory changed. And that's what compels him to act. Very interesting. So he gets in his mind that here he is in the most cultured city in Europe, hearing that Jews should all be killed. And he says, if that can happen in Paris, what can happen in the other cities? So he decides, with absolutely no plan, with absolutely no money, that he is going to get the Jews to move back to Palestine. And what he's thinking here is, I'm going to get the Jews of the West. Right? He'd heard, various little things about the Jews of the East and what they're doing. But he says, I'm going to get the Jews in Germany, Jews in Austria, Jews in France. I'm going to get them to move. Here's how I'm going to do it. He goes to one of the richest Jews in the world, Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who was spending approximately $36 million in those years' money, right? That's US dollars. $36 million a year to create Jewish colonies in Argentina and Brazil. Right? So Baron Maurice de Hirsch realized we got to get them out of Europe, so he spends $36 million a year to create colonies in Argentina and Brazil. Now, the problem with this plan, as Herzl pointed out, is that he was creating people who had no skills. Right? He sends them there, and then they live on his money the rest of their lives. And it was exactly what was happening in Palestine that we saw yesterday. It was just rich Jews paying for these people to live there, and they were never taught how to farm, they were never taught any industry, nothing like that. They just live off of the money that they're given. So, Herzl says, he gets a meeting with Baron Hirsch, and he says, this is where Herzl's overconfidence sometimes didn't work out very well for him. He approaches the Baron and he says, I want you to know that your plans of sending Jews to Argentina and Brazil are terrible. And the Baron says, what do you mean? They're terrible. I'm saving people's lives. And Herzl says, no, you're not. You're not saving people's lives. Because in fact, you're just making their lives horrible. Because they're moving to some new place, they have no skills, you've just taken them out from being killed in Europe, and now they're just going to die in South America. Is that what you want? And the Baron, very surprised by this penniless Jew who has approached him, and he doesn't even know who this guy is, right? He's just a journalist. He says, actually, what I would like is for you to leave my house. And Herzl says, what? Leave your house? And he says, you come in, you insult me, you have absolutely no plan. You tell me that Jews are going to rally to go to Palestine. Yeah, right. How are you going to make that happen? And Herzl says, well, I'll have a flag. And they'll rally to the flag, right? You can see this idealism. He has no clue what he's talking about. He says, I'll have a flag. And Hirsch says, do you have a flag? And he says, no, but I'll have one. And Hirsch says, yeah, why don't you leave? And that's the end of the conversation, right? So, as a result of that, Herzl says, you know what? I need a plan. I need some kind of plan so that when I go to these financiers, I can figure out and persuade them that they need to listen to me and make this happen. So he writes the book called Der Judenstaat. It's a little pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state. German. And this is what he says. Notice how similar this is to the writings from the Eastern leaders that we read. He says, we have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted to us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native land in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still, there it is, decried as aliens. We're still seen as foreigners, often by men whose ancestors had not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country. In other words, he's saying, we're still seen as foreigners, even though we've been there longer than these people. The majority decides who the alien is. This and all else in the relations between peoples is a matter of power. So he publishes this, it's a little pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, and he sends it throughout the Jewish communities of Europe. And this is the key, right? Those in the East pick up Der Judenstaat and they say, this is what we've been saying. And here is a Jewish journalist employed by the biggest paper in Europe, writing from Paris, saying these things. And the East says, this man is our king. That's the words that they use, Hamelech. Right? They even say it in Hebrew. They call him Hamelech. So he's able to rally those from the East, and he's able to get a handful of those from the West, because he has somewhat status in the Jewish community. 1897, in where? Anyone know? Basel, Switzerland. Basel, Switzerland. He brings together the first Zionist Congress. Now, this really was not actually that big of a deal as far as influence. He wanted it to be this big black tie affair, you know, where people came and they rubbed shoulders with very famous people, all kinds of politicians. Well, no politician showed up. Nobody shows up like that. The two famous people that come, I forget who the other one is, but one of them is Max Nordau, who was a novelist, right? And Herzl's like, well, take what you can get. This is good. And so he's very happy. This is